Okay, last week we were on to the Civil War, and this is a very cursory examination of the Civil War. I mean, when you think about the Civil War, there's been either a book or a pamphlet published on average every single day since the end of the Civil War. Uh, and yet I would argue that still it's vastly misunderstood. And really, when we've said that the victors write the history, that certainly wasn't the case in the Civil War when the losers wrote the history or rewrote it. And I think only now, within the last maybe 40 years, have historians come back and really started re-examining the war and getting at least the historical perspective correct. So the last time we were talking about the beginning of the war. We'd gone through the first Battle of Bull Run. We had talked about the Battle of Shiloh and the fact that Shiloh was so many dead. And I even recommended a book, This Republic Suffering by Drew Galpin Faust, former president of Harvard, and that the Union strategy, just to restate, was the so-called Anaconda Plan, which is going to be the plan that they eventually succeed in using, which was to blockade the southern coastline, to invade down the rivers, the Mississippi, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee, and split the Confederacy in half, and then keep an army, the Army of the Potomac, keeping pressure on Richmond. Whereas the southern strategy was to fight a defensive war, hold out to a point that maybe northern voters would say we're tired of the war, let them go, hold out for this idea that maybe the French or the British would come to their aid. And again, we have to make sure that we don't read history backwards, where, again, if you go back and you watch Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War, and there's Shelby Foote saying the South had no chance to win, they certainly thought they had a chance to win, and that's what's important. And to make the statement as clear as we can is that they almost did win this war. So let's go back and keep in mind, when we start talking about this war, there are two theaters: the Western theater, where the Union is just crushing it, right? They're defeating the Confederates left and right. You don't hear as much about that, partly because of lost cause mythology. You hear more about what was going on in the North with Robert E. Lee. But out West, the Union Army is crushing the Confederacy. But back East, it's a different story. Now, Lincoln had replaced the commander at Bull Run, Irwin McDowell, with George McClellan. This is going to be the so-called Peninsular Campaign. After Bull Run, it had been quiet on that eastern side for about 9 months. Now, George McClellan looks like a good leader. I mean, his nickname is the Young Napoleon. He's the young Napoleon, and it seems like the troops like him. He likes a well-trained army. He marches them and drills them constantly, but he's also got some character flaws. One, he's going to be overly cautious, very, very cautious, and this is going to strike him or stand against him when he needs to take a bold move. And he has an incredible ego. I mean, if you think mine's big, it's nothing compared to George McClellan. He thinks he's better than the president. We can read his letters where he refers to the president as the original guerrilla and what a moron the president is, and only George McClellan can save the country. Well, McClellan drills and drills his army, and Lincoln is sort of sitting there going, okay, look, he's drilling the army. That looks great. The soldiers, they all look great. But is he going to attack? So finally, Lincoln orders McClellan, go 90 miles down there, capture Richmond. McClellan brags that he'll be in Richmond in 10 days. Okay, well, we know that's not going to happen. And in March of 1862, Confederates attack Union troops at the Battle of Seven Pines, sometimes also known as the Battle of Fair Oaks. Union reinforcements arrived just in time to prevent another Union defeat. McClellan had been fooled by what they called Quaker guns, where all you do is you take logs and you paint them black and make them look like cannon. And he thought they were stronger than they really were. He constantly inflates the number of Confederates that he's going to run into, again, being overly cautious. One of the more interesting parts about the Battle of Seven Pines is that the Confederate general, Joseph Johnston, is severely wounded. And now Robert E. Lee is in charge. Now, Robert E. Lee is going to be a superb field commander. He's not going to be able to beat Grant. And as we look back at Lee, Lee uh, was a brilliant soldier, but we need to keep in mind that he was offered the command of the Union armies first. He declined. He decided to go with his state. But remember, he's a slaveholder, and he's fighting for the cause of slavery, and he's fighting to destroy the Union. Now, I try to tell students that if you're mad that Jane Fonda went to Vietnam and showed up on an anti-aircraft gun and you're still holding that on her, you should be holding this on Robert E. Lee, right? Because that's what Lee is. He's essentially, as these Confederates are, under the basic idea, is a traitor. And now we're seeing that, even today, we're seeing that they're going to rename a lot of these forts later on. In fact, there's a new book out. If I can just pull it up on my phone real quick, give me a second. Written by a former West Point historian. He just resigned from West Point and is writing this book. And it's called, I believe, one second. You know, right when I wanted to pull it fast, it doesn't. Okay. The name of the book is Robert E. Lee and Me, and it's by Ty Seidel. If you don't know him, he did a nice little video for Prager University online talking about the cause of the war. And the interesting part about this is that he's one of these guys that was idolizing Lee, and then he started to study him and then goes, wait a minute, this isn't the person I think he was. And this isn't anything unusual. Go look up in the New York Times within the last 3 weeks or so. There was a lady who was writing on a Lithuanian hero that was a national hero who was her great-grandfather, and she found out that her great-grandfather actually had rounded up Jews and over 2,000 Jews and had them murdered. So it's really difficult when we go back and look at the past and see what these people were fighting for. So Lee is fighting for slavery, but he's a brilliant commander, no doubt about it. So let's get to the Second Battle of Bull Run. McClellan was ordered back to Washington to protect the capital because after the Battle of Fair Oaks, they thought, oh, we're going to be attacked. Lincoln puts in another general in charge by the name of John Pope and tells him to attack Richmond. Pope and his troops fight the Confederates at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Pope is thoroughly outmatched as a general. He's confused. The Confederate cavalry is striking here, there, led by Jeb Stuart. They actually sneak behind Union lines and they steal Pope's dress uniform from his tent. Pope exhausts his men looking for the Confederates, and by the time he runs into them, they're exhausted and the Union army is forced to retreat. Pope is disgraced and he's sent to Minnesota to fight Native Americans. So Lincoln has to order McClellan to take a command again. Well, and of course, if you read McClellan's letters, he's talking about only I can save the Union. The original guerrilla is calling me back in. He's a moron. It's pretty bad. And that's going to bring us to the Battle of Antietam. Lee wants to stay on the offensive. He wants to move the fight to Union soil. If he could move the fight to Union soil, then maybe Britain and France might say, hey, the Confederacy could win, and that could bring foreign aid. And if we could bring it to Union soil, again, that's punching the Union in the nose, and maybe the public opinion would turn against Lincoln and they would settle for a peace. So Lee leads his troops into Western Pennsylvania and into Western Maryland and heads for Pennsylvania. Now, here's one of these strange things that happens in war. Lee's plans are uncovered when a Union soldier picks up a bundle of cigars, and rolled up in this bundle of cigars are Lee's secret orders, what his plan of attack is going to be. What are the odds? The paper revealed that Lee had split his forces. That's something you don't do tactically, right? When you have your army smaller than your opponent, and then you split even further to make two armies smaller, even smaller than your opponent, that's tactically not a good idea. Lee had sent part of his army under Stonewall Jackson to attack Harper's Ferry, and then Lee was going to move into Pennsylvania. McClellan thinks this is his big chance. He goes, I've got his plans. I know what he's going to do. And then, as we said about McClellan, he's overly cautious. He waits 16 hours. He goes, Look, I know this is what he's going to do, but maybe his troops are stronger than I think. We'll delay, we'll delay. And by this time, Lee has found out, they have spies, that his plans have been uncovered. And this allows Lee time to reassemble his forces behind Antietam Creek. And on September 17th, the battle begins. And it's a bloody battle. It's going to be the bloodiest single day of the war with 23 casualties. The creek turned red. There was corn. The corn is mowed down just by the number of bullets. The Confederate lines are about to break when the Confederate General A.P. Hill arrives and maintains the line. The battle is a standoff, even though the Confederates were outnumbered this day 2-1. Late in the day, McClellan backs his forces off and allows Lee to escape. And McClellan does not give chase. Lee later on said that if McClellan had given chase, they would have destroyed the Southern Army. But McClellan tells Lincoln in a telegram that his horses were exhausted. And Lincoln responded to the telegram, what have you done that would have exhausted anything? And then P.S., you're fired, right? He reassigns McClellan to recruiting duty in New Jersey. Of course, McClellan's not going to take this very well and will become the Democratic nominee for president in 1864. So Lincoln, doing well out west, but can't find that leader in the Eastern Theater. So he's got a new Union commander, and that's Ambrose Burnside, right? And this is going to be the Battle of Fredericksburg, which, by the way, you can go to Fredericksburg today, and parts of the buildings that were at the battle still stand. Now, Burnside says, I'm going to be aggressive. I'll attack even in December. As you know, if you've studied any history of the time period, usually you went into winter quarters because it was hard to feed your troops and your livestock. But he said, I'll attack even in the middle of winter. So in December 13th to be precise, Burnside moves to attack Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, the Confederates have the high ground, and they're behind stone walls. In fact, even today, there's still part of that stone wall there, and you can go see it. And there's even a house where a woman lived that's right in front of the stone wall that still has the bullet holes, which one of them went through and shot her through the heart and killed her. To get to this high ground, Union troops have to cross a mile of open field. Now, if you remember from the last lecture, this is the time of the rifle musket revolution, where you could fire almost continually as a defender on attackers at a much greater range and greater accuracy, right? So the Confederates have a clean line of fire, and the first line of Union troops come across this field and they're mowed down. So Burnside says, let's try that again. And so they try it again and they're mowed down. He goes, let's try the third time. They try the third time, mowed down. He goes, let's try it a fourth time, mowed down. Let's try it 5 times, mowed down. 6 times, mowed down. Finally, Burnside orders a retreat. Now, let's take a moment to think about that. Okay, you've seen the first 3 rows mowed down, and then you're called to go. Your turn to go across that field. You know what's going to happen. You're going to get mowed down. But the soldiers kept going. One journalist on the scene said it could hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor or generals to manifest less judgment. Burnside, crying, orders the retreat. If you go there today, and this battle was in December 1862, if you go there today, you can go to the grave and you can see that there are just certain numbers because they buried people 6 feet deep or sit on top of each other, 6, 6, and 6. So many people in a grave because there were so many casualties. But Antietam and Fredericksburg really made the British, who were close, the British were very close to recognizing the Confederacy, to change their mind. So did what happened on January 1st, 1863. And that was the Emancipation Proclamation. The problem was, what do you do with runaway slaves? Now, Lincoln, who originally said he wanted to maintain the Union because he felt that he had no power to abolish slavery, and an attempt to abolish slavery would make the border states fly over to the Confederacy, now can use a constitutional power by saying freeing slaves is a way of depriving the enemy of material, right? Confiscation of war material. And freeing the slaves would make the war a moral cause because Britain and France had already abolished slavery, and they really couldn't go in there into a war supporting slavery. So the proclamation, what it did was it freed all slaves in rebellious territories, not in Kentucky, which was not a rebellious territory, or Missouri, not a rebellious territory, but in rebellious territories held by the Union. And this gets back to the question historians are asked often, who freed the slaves? Was it Lincoln? Well, you could say, yeah. Was it the Army? The Army went through the South and allowed slaves to run away, enslaved people to get to someplace safety. Or did the slaves free the slaves? In many cases, yes, they ran away and got to their freedom. One of the things that the Emancipation Proclamation will do, it'll allow African Americans to join the Army. And by 1863, Black regiments played significant parts in all major battles. In fact, many Union commanders tell Lincoln that the use of what they called colored troops constituted the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebels. Almost 200,000 will serve in the war, and 38,000 will die in the war. Now, interestingly enough, for these African American troops, they're not treated as prisoners of war. We know that the famous Fort Pillow massacre, in which the Confederates just shot and killed African American troops, that probably Nathaniel Bedford Forrest was involved in, which, by the way, there's a national park named after him. He's also one of the earlier members of the Klan. But often they will just shoot African American troops. And you've probably seen parts of that, like in the movie Glory. Let's take a break from the battles for just a second and talk about paying for the war real quickly. How did both sides do it really quick? The North will have more taxes, higher tariffs. They'll have an income tax, which will later be declared unconstitutional. Remember, the South was the first to create the income tax. And then they printed paper money, which they called greenbacks, which was legal tender, which were greenbacks because they were green and they could be used for payment of all debts. And they also went into debt, and they also borrowed money from states. Now, the South, they don't have such a luxury. They're going to issue unbacked paper money, and they're just going to keep issuing paper money over and over again, printing it up so you just run away inflation so that the currency was worthless. So let's wrap this up. Let's talk about the faltering Confederacy. There's a new general in town, Joseph Hooker, leading Union forces. Now, let's clear up. There's this myth that the phrase hookers came from Joseph Hooker because prostitutes followed the camp, and they were known as hookers girls. And people think that's the word hooker came from. It's not true. We've looked back, we've seen that word hooker show up before these battles. He has 130,000 troops massed. Now, let's think about that too. When Hooker leads his forces into the South, his army becomes the second largest city in the South. So again, we go back to, you talk about tactics, which is what amateurs study, but professionals study logistics, which means that you have to be able to feed, clothe, arm, and supply the second largest city in the South. So he decides to attack the Confederates at Chancellorsville. Hooker doesn't do as well either against Lee. Hooker is confused by Lee's hit and run tactics and eventually driven from the field of battle. But for Lee, it's a costly victory, 12,000 casualties, including Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson is accidentally shot by his own men, friendly fire, and dies later. Jackson was not a brilliant strategic commander, or tactical commander, but when Lee gave him orders, he could carry them out very efficiently, and he's dead. So shift back out west to Vicksburg. Now, Lee is holding Union forces at bay in the east. We've said this, but out west, it's a different story. Grant is moving throughout the west. Now, he wants to capture Vicksburg. It's a Confederate stronghold. You get Vicksburg, you've got the Mississippi. So he decides to surround the city and starve the Confederates out. It's siege warfare, right? And it works because the Confederates end up having to eat everything. They eat their horses, they eat cats, they eat dogs, they even eat sometimes wood, I guess lots of fiber. And so Vicksburg is under siege. So Lee knows this. He's getting information that Vicksburg's under siege. They may have to surrender. So Lee wants to create a distraction in the east. He thinks that if he could win a major victory on Union soil, it might end the war. So he's going to move into Pennsylvania. Union forces under General Meade encounter Confederate troops at Gettysburg on June 30th through July 1st as the battle begins. Confederate troops drive Union troops out of the town of Gettysburg, but onto higher, more secure ground. Meade calls for reinforcements. On July 2nd, Lee is hampered by a lack of information. He doesn't know what's going on in this major battlefield, partly because Jeb Stuart, his cavalry, which was your version of your reconnaissance drones, was missing. He couldn't find Lee, so he wasn't sure what's happened. So Lee launches attacks on Meade's left and right flanks. Both our attacks are repulsed. And by the way, if you get a chance to tour Gettysburg, it's well worth it. You can go to there, you can go to Gettysburg, and they have professors from Gettysburg University a lot of times. And if you just hire them, I think it's like $65, they hop in your car and they take you on a tour of the battlefield. Well worth the money. So Lee had ordered on July 2nd attacks on the left and right flank. On July 3rd, Lee thinks that Union troops are demoralized. He goes, yep, I think they're demoralized. I think if we attack in the center of the Union lines, that'll be it. They'll break and they'll run. He's absolutely wrong, and it's a fatal mistake. Now it's Southern troops' turn to cross 700 yards of open field. Union artillery and musket fire devastate them. Of the 14,000 that cross that field, only 7,000 return. Confederates flee the battlefield, and on the same day, Vicksburg falls. At Gettysburg, you get 51,000 casualties in all. It's horrendous loss of life. They end up having to bury the dead 3 times. They bury them once. It rains. The rain forces the bodies to the surface. So they bury them again. People come in and dig the bodies up to take gold out of the teeth and steal things. And so they bury them a 3rd time. And of course, it becomes the site of Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, where you can go to the cemetery where he did give that speech. They don't know exactly where. So I just walked all over the cemetery so I could at least step somewhere near where he said it. And of course, remember, Lincoln was not the keynote speaker there. And Gary Willis, and I forgot the name of the book, had written a book about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. They had another person speak who spoke for 2 hours. 2 hours. Lincoln speaks for about 5 minutes. And of course, it's Lincoln's speech that we remember most of all, right? It's the one that we remember. So I think there's something to be said for brevity in these kind of cases. And so now, in March of 1864, Lincoln puts Grant in charge of all Union Army. And Grant is going to bring a new strategy. His strategy is that he's going to move all the Union armies simultaneously. So against the Confederacy, that means there's going to be pressure against the Confederacy on all fronts. And he says it's always going to be attack. We're not going to go there and attack and then retreat all the way back. We are going to be on the aggressive the whole time. And he's going to fight a war of attrition. He knows by this time in the battle that the Confederates are running out of men. They are limited, right? And the North has got plenty more. And so Grant does care about his soldiers, but he knows that in a longer war, he's going to have more men at the end. And Grant's going to begin what he calls a scorched earth policy. He's going to burn everything that can be of use to the Confederate Army. So Grant's going to pursue Lee, and the first battle is going to be the Battle of the Wilderness. Now, Grant has 115,000, Lee has 65,000. The Battle of the Wilderness goes on May 5th and 6th, 1864. It's one of these battles that it's horrific. There are brush fires. You don't really see the enemy. You look for somebody moving and you shoot and you kill them, right? You see something move and you shoot. Lee loses about 31,000 men. Grant loses about 55,000 men. But Grant has got more to draw from at this point. Lee is running out of replacements. And Grant, unlike earlier generals, keeps chasing Lee. He's not going to back off, right? He's going to make Lee keep backing up. Both sides will fight again at Cold Harbor on June 1st through June 3rd. Union forces are repulsed again, but Grant keeps up the pressure and surrounds Lee at Petersburg, which will begin a 9-month siege. Lee is trapped. He's not going to get out of this one. And as he's trapped around Petersburg, bad news for the Confederacy is pouring in, mainly in the name of William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman is marching toward Atlanta. He's chasing Confederate General, Texas General John Hood. Hood tries to defend Atlanta but cannot, and Sherman captures the city. Now, if you've watched Gone with the Wind, they make it look like they burned Atlanta completely. This is not true. Sherman pretty much burns just things that were going to be used for the war effort. Many fires were actually started by Confederates as they were trying to deny Union soldiers supplies. Hood tries to distract Sherman to move westward into Tennessee and away from the Deep South, but Sherman doesn't take the bait. He'll send another Union general, General George Thomas, and at the Battle of Franklin, Hood and Thomas forces meet. Confederates are forced to charge over 2 miles of open field to attack Union forces. And again, they make 6 charges and are wiped out each time. One Confederate general had been shot 49 times. The good news is only one of them was fatal. Sherman keeps marching into the Deep South. December 21st, he takes Savannah, Georgia. And then February 17th, attacks and captures Charleston, South Carolina, often sending in African-American troops to take control of the city, especially South Carolina. People look at South Carolina and they're angry with South Carolina. South Carolina has been the troublemaker. On April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. This was an important surrender, at least on Lee's part, because the Southerners could have fought a guerrilla warfare for a long, long time. Lee says, no, just go home. Jefferson Davis is forced to flee. And on May 10th, Jefferson Davis is captured. As for Lincoln, when it came to Jefferson Davis, and we'll get to Lincoln and what happens to him in our next lecture, he didn't mind if Jefferson Davis escaped and made it to another country. So the cost of the war, I'll say this, when I was growing up, that we had estimates at 630,000 lives. Historians now estimate that the cost of war was closer to 720,000 lives. And when we look at the cost of 720,000 lives, a lot of those people, over 2/3 of them, will die just of disease. It won't be in battle. So those people that thought they were going to go off to glorious battle, they do not. And for many of them, it's not a war that they go back and look fondly upon. William McKinley had fought in the war. James Garfield had fought in the war. A lot of the people that'll be president had fought in the war, and were still haunted by the war. We know that we call it PTSD now, but back then they didn't know that. For the South, it's going to be another disaster. Some historians have estimated that in modern dollars, the impact on the South and its economy was close to $13 trillion. And that the South will lag behind. And even today, when you look at some of the states that are lagging economically, they tend to be the southern states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas. These are deep southern states that have been impacted by the war, and it hasn't gone away. So the war ends. And now the problem becomes, early on in the war, is how do we get the states back together? How do we get the Union back together and create governments that are loyal to the Union? And that's going to be a problem that we'll face in the next lecture.